heritage, but rather, like any parent, he wanted what was best for his child. And in those days, for so many Americans, and not just Italian Americans, it was easier to get ahead if you changed your name. And of course, as we know, so many people had their names changed for them at the ports of entry, in the workplace, in the schools, and elsewhere. So this little fellow grew up to be a public relations expert, political consultant, internationally recognized Italian-American leader in California, from his base in California. In the early part of the last decade, he became a grandfather for the first time. His grandson's name is Salvatore Chirel, or Sorel. The family has had discussions about reattaching the A to their surname, at least for the little boy, because there aren't many male Chirellas left in America, and they're concerned that that line is going to die out eventually. I don't know if they made this decision, but let us stop and reflect for a moment about how things have come full circle. How in 1941, proud person, Salvatore Chirella, may someday have a great-grandson who has the exact same name, even though he changed the surname for his son, illustrating how things have gone in a good direction for Italian Americans. I was born in the 1970s, and there are far more Jasons and Jennifers in my generation than Antonios and Giovannas. But beginning in the 1970s, we saw some Italian-American parents giving their children these traditional names and doing so full well expecting that the kids might never Americanize them. Because today, and in recent years, very few people of Italian descent would feel that they have to change their names to get ahead in America. And as recently as the 1960s in our country, people were doing so. Some folks, not a huge number, but some, in the last 15 to 20 years, have considered going back to their original family names, and in some cases have done so. This is a spontaneous national movement that I've heard throughout our country. More people don't do it because if you're established with one name, let's say you're 50 years old and your name is John White, you have a small business in a community, and if at the age of 50 you want to go back to being John Bianco, your original family name years and years before, it can create confusion. So that's one of the reasons that more people probably don't do this. But for our purposes, what is significant is the fact that folks feel comfortable considering doing this if they want to do so. And we're seeing individuals, in some cases, insisting on pronouncing their names the Italian way. I'm comfortable with an American or anglicized pronunciation of my last name, but in the last 10 to 15 years, I've seen people who are not from Italian backgrounds making an effort to pronounce it the way it would be pronounced in Europe. Again, I think an example of the inclusion and acceptance we've been seeing. The fourth story that I'd like to share this evening comes to us from Pueblo, Colorado, a place where for more than a century, at least 8 to 10% of the people have had some ancestral connection to Italy. The Italians went to Pueblo, as they did to so many parts of our country in those days, to do jobs that the native-born Americans didn't want to do. When my great-grandfather came to this country in 1902, the ship manifest at Ellis Island describes him as illiterate and his occupation as that of a peasant. This is a story shared by millions of our people and not just Italian Americans. As you might expect, folks who went to Pueblo in many cases started pretty close to the bottom, were looked down upon by many of the Anglo-Americans who were already there in southern Colorado. Many of the people in the Italian diaspora who came to Colorado were from the south of Italy and had differing shades of olive skin, dark brown or black hair, and dark-colored eyes. They stood out in a visual sense from the Anglo-Americans who were already there. In those days, virtually all of them were Roman Catholic, in a place where not everybody was or is Roman Catholic. And for those who had wonderful names with lots of vowels, these names were a bit different from what the Anglo-Americans in Pueblo were used to. So for all these reasons, in the years before the Second World War, The Italian immigrants and their descendants could be on the margins in Pueblo. There were dance halls, skating rinks, movie theaters, and at least one fraternal organization that would not admit Italians as members. An older man of my acquaintance, his name is Ralph, the son of Sicilian immigrants, born in our country in 1915, remembers how in the late 1920s and the 1930s, some people in Pueblo, not many, but some, would come up to him and they would say, "You're nothing but a wop. You're nothing but a wop." They did so to downgrade him, to disparage him, to make him feel as if he wasn't as good as they were. 2006, in one of my visits to Pueblo, Ralph, who's now well into his 90s, asked me, he said, "Has anyone ever called you a wop?" He reduced me to silence, not because I was tallying up the number of times people have called me that. I have a very Italian-American name. But rather, it didn't even occur to me, at that time I was 32, that something like that would happen. When I speak to young people, I have to explain to them about the word wop because it's something for people who are in their teens and their 20s. In most cases, they haven't heard. Ralph remembers 1935 going to a dance hall in Pueblo where there was a sign outside that read, "No dogs or Italians allowed." During the evening of Saturday, December 6th, 1941, another older man of my acquaintance, his name is Tony, he's now deceased, also like Ralph, the son of Sicilian immigrants. He went to a dance hall in Pueblo with 5 or 6 of his friends. The gentleman at the door looked at them and he asked them, "Where are your membership cards?" He wasn't asking people from other ethnic backgrounds for their membership cards. Rather, it was a polite way of saying, "Listen, gentlemen, we don't want you here. Please go away." The good news is, the very next day, Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor Day, a tragic day for our country, everything began to change for Tony and the Italians of Pueblo. Tony's wife, who's of German descent, as is my mother, likes to say that on December 7th, 1941, her husband became American, fully American, for the first time. Now keep in mind, this is someone who was born in our country in 1918. Someone who was raised and socialized to think of himself as an American. Someone who went through our schools where he learned to view the Pilgrims and George Washington and Abraham Lincoln as his icons and his heroes. But in his wife's opinion at least, he did not become American, fully American, for the first time until the age of 23. What Tony's wife means by this is that when people in Pueblo and throughout America saw how Tony and his compatriots in the Italian-American community and many different communities, my Italian-American grandfather was certainly part of this wave, folks rushed to enlist in our nation's military, volunteering in many cases, not waiting to be drafted. This went a long way toward bringing people of Italian descent into the mainstream of the country. Folks throughout the United States saw how women of Italian descent and from every other ethnic background played an equally important role, much of the time here on the home front, in the factories, and in other ways, supporting and building the war effort. After all, Rosie the Riveter, who's commonly acknowledged as the symbol of American women's participation in the Second World War, is thought to be based on an Italian-American from New York State, Rose Bonavita. Folks of all ages in the Italian-American community flew the American flag, purchased war bonds, and in other ways signaled that they were fully, completely, unequivocally behind this country in her time of need. All of these actions, all of these activities helped to bring people of Italian descent firmly into the mainstream of American culture, to the point that the Second World War was a turning point. And as we remember, people of Italian descent proved themselves then, as we all know. For a time during the early months of the war, 600,000 people of Italian descent in this country